I'm Maria Grosengate. I'm the Associate Director of the African Studies Program at Indiana University Bloomington. And I'm here to welcome all of you to this Doing Business in and with Africa conference today. I'm very delighted that my colleagues at the Center for International Business Education and Research organized this event. I think we'll have many interesting presentations and hopefully lively discussion. It's a very appropriate and timely topic, and Africa has a long history of trade and entrepreneurship, and that's often overshadowed by the negative events that come from the continent, or the negative news that we hear about the continent. So thank you. Welcome everyone, the audience, members of the panels, the invited speakers, and the moderators. I also want to thank the committee members who were involved in planning this event. Peter Kirkwood and Enzuya Naiken of the International Center here in Indianapolis, and Tom Miller of the PNC Bank. And my very special thanks to Christine Everett and Vicki Dixon of the CIBER, the Center for International Business Education and Research. This is in the Cali School of Business. Unfortunately, our keynote speaker, the original keynote speaker, Lida Fitz of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, was unable to come. She had a last-minute business in Ghana, so she had to leave on very short notice. But I don't think we're any the worse of it, because David Riposo will replace her, and I will introduce him in a minute. I just want to mention that Monica Brown was to be on the first panel initially. She also was unable to come, but she is replaced by Patricia Seck. And then in the afternoon, George Thruer was unable to attend, and unfortunately we were not able to find a replacement for him. The event will be recorded, but if you need to go out and for something, go ahead, it's not a problem. So I'm very delighted that David Riposo could join us here. He is the Finance and Implementation Manager for Sub-Saharan Africa at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. So Lida Fitz knew what she was doing when she recommended him as her replacement. And in his position, he helps energy ventures in Sub-Saharan Africa achieve financial and commercial operation. Before joining the agency, he led donor-funded energy access programs in Africa and South Asia for 5 years. And before then, he was a strategy consultant advising companies and governments on clean energy markets and technologies. His professional experience also includes establishing a renewable energy consulting business in India and helping many wind and solar project developers define pre-construction energy generation potential of their projects. He has an MS degree from the University of Maryland in College Park. Let's welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Raposo, and welcome, Mr. Raposo.
Great. Well, thanks again for the introduction, and thanks all to the CIBER team. It's a privilege to be here, and once again, Lida Fitz, my colleague, sends her regrets. She's presently about halfway to Nigeria, where she will be attending a conference with the Africa Finance Corporation for the next several days. My objective with this talk is to hopefully set the stage for the conversation to come over the course of the day and discuss the challenges and opportunities associated with doing business in and with Africa, I would like to describe for you a little bit about what the U.S. government is doing in this domain to try to improve the situation. And then I would like to describe for you what my very small agency is doing in our circumscribed role. I would like to describe for you what the U.S. Trade and Development Agency is doing to help U.S. businesses access opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I have a feeling we're going to be having a number of different versions of this conversation today, discussing the challenges and the opportunities associated with doing business in Africa. Vicky et al. Have asked me to focus in on power, and for very good reason. USTDA, the broader U.S. government, and the business community, we all perceive this to be a real constraint to economic growth. And there are many ways in which access to electricity and lack of it constrains economic growth. 600 million Africans, as is well known, living without access to electricity. Those with access to electricity often don't have reliable access. If that feeder line is leading to your house, often it goes dark for however many hours or days at a time. And this is not only an inconvenience, but a serious constraint to economic growth. On the other side of that coin, each of those 600 million that lack access represent a kind of a business opportunity. If you're able to access that opportunity, the risk is tremendous, but the rewards in turn are also quite substantial if you're able to be successful. We feel quite strongly that U.S. businesses are in a unique position to help unravel some of these challenges and do so in a way that's profitable. And that position is widely held across the U.S. government, which is foremost among the reasons why in 2013 the previous administration launched the Power Africa program. If you're not familiar with the Power Africa program, a brief overview, and I'll be happy to address any questions that you might have about it. This is an interagency effort that is U.S. government sponsored, but convenes a number of other bilateral donors, a number of other multilateral development banks, and we are all motivated towards the shared objectives of helping 60 million Africans access energy, building out the capacity of Africa to generate energy by 30,000 megawatts, all by 2030. This is quite an ambitious undertaking, and although government is playing a leadership role, the private sector is really out front. The objective of Power Africa is to provide catalytic funding, to provide catalytic capacity building that will crowd in private sector money and private sector capacity in order to achieve these objectives. This isn't about the U.S. government trying to prescribe solutions and pay for them, rather to crowd in the private sector to help do some of that work for the benefit of the private sector and Africa. Many U.S. government agencies are supporting this initiative. The Export Credit Bank, the U.S. Exim Bank, for example, can provide very low interest loans to organizations that want to import U.S. goods to Africa. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, can provide very low interest concessional debt to U.S. investors that want to do business in Africa. USAID and the Millennium Challenge Corporation are building the capacity of African institutions to incorporate more power into their power systems and to expand access, especially in rural areas. Our agency has a a narrow role, but it's I believe quite important in the landscape of power project promotion, of infrastructure project promotion very broadly, but in the context of today's discussion of power project promotion. So I would like to discuss the role of US TDA in all of this, first at a global level, but then let's drill down a bit and discuss what's going on in Africa, just our Africa portfolio more broadly. The mission of US TDA, of the US Trade and Development Agency, is simply to promote US manufacturing. And we do that by extending grant capital to infrastructure ventures in emerging markets all over the world. We're a small organization, only about 45 full-time employees on 2 floors of an office building in suburban Washington, D.C. But we have supported over 500 infrastructure projects in Africa alone since our founding. Excuse me. We support activities that will help shepherd infrastructure projects along from the conception stage to a stage where they will be able to seek public and private sector sources of funding. So from a conception stage to a place where they're bankable. And along that development journey, we are exposing infrastructure project promoters to what we consider to be the virtue of US enterprise, of US manufacturing, so that when the project is finally built, the fraction of US export content will be very high. Often our grant-funded enterprises will include scope elements such as the engineering technical analysis required to define the very technical parameters of the infrastructure that's proposed. We will help with the creation of environmental analyses to identify environmental risk and mitigate it wherever that's necessary. We will work with whatever policy and regulatory regime in the country context to help ensure that all of the licensing and documentation is in place at the end of our terms of reference, so that once complete, that project is tied up with a bow and ready to seek financing. We've been at this for a number of decades, since the early 80s, and we feel that we're quite good at it. Just last year, so in the FY16, we identified about $3 billion in exports that were attributable in that year to our activities. Now, we have a staff that is of about 3 people who are devoted to monitoring this kind of thing full time. We have accountants that are essentially looking over their shoulders, making sure that the data are substantial and withstand scrutiny. And we have additional accountants looking over the shoulders of those accountants, so we're quite certain of these numbers, that there are a great deal of exports that are directly attributable to the work that we do. We feel just as strongly that there are jobs, US manufacturing jobs, that are attributable to those exports, about 18,000 in the most recent financial year. Since TDA was founded, we feel that about $57 billion of attributable exports have been realized. And the final number, I think, is the most important, a nice, succinct summary of kind of who we are and the type of impact that we have. When a dollar of U.S. taxpayer funding is appropriated to U.S. TDA, we can attribute $85 of U.S. export content as a result of the technical assistance that we're able to provide through our grant funding. So that's a look at who we are from a global perspective. In Africa, we are an implementing agency of this much broader interagency effort of Power Africa. And we play a role really at the sort of the origination stage. Power Africa, recall, is all about new capacity, new connections. In a Power Africa context, we are responsible for identifying new power projects. All the way at the headwaters of the project development lifecycle, we are responsible for identifying the infrastructure project promoters who have the highest likelihood of achieving financial close, identifying a scope of work that will help them get from wherever they are in their development lifecycle to a stage where they are ready to be bankable. We have 57 projects today. As of later this afternoon, we will have 58, if all goes well at our board meeting. And each of these projects is percolating towards financial close at one degree of maturity or another. That final figure of $3 billion, I must apologize for that. This is an old slide that I pulled in from a previous deck. The latest figure is more like 6.5. Just to be clear, that's $6.5 billion in potential exports that we anticipate we can realize through our Power Africa portfolio alone, which I'm quite proud of. But that's just on the U.S. export content side, which is an important piece of the puzzle, and it's the one that I think principally we'll be talking about today. The impact side of the story, I think, is just as important. This is more than a gigawatt of potential new generation capacity. This gets us a long way down the field towards the objectives of Power Africa. And along the way, 2 million Africans will be connected to the grid or otherwise have access to commercial high-quality energy where they didn't before. And since anecdotes are kind of fun, I'll describe a little bit the picture on the right. This is one of sort of a representation of one of the grantees, so one of the 58 plus or minus in our portfolio presently. The grantee for this project, not pictured, is a gentleman named Caleb King. He is a medical doctor who is also an electrical engineer trained at MIT. He's also a Methodist missionary, and after the genocide in Rwanda in the middle 90s, he was inspired to pack up his family and move to a remote corner of northern Rwanda near the border with DRC. This is a conflict region that even before the genocide was racked by generations of conflict, and the infrastructure was in a very sorry state, as you can imagine. Being a medical doctor, he took over a hospital. With his own equity, he rebuilt it essentially from the ground up. As the years went by, though, he noticed that not having access to a reliable energy source meant that he had to pull in diesel generators, and the expense was doing violence to his bottom line, was making it really difficult for his self-funded medical enterprise to be sustainable. So he worked with Ustda to essentially go into the power business. That corner of rural Rwanda is surrounded on all sides by rivers, which throughout the year, so there's no seasonality really to these rivers, they have really great power generation profiles, really steep hills and steady flow that doesn't really attenuate in the dry season. With Ustda's support, he established the feasibility of a whole cascade of hydropower projects that are quite close not only to his hospital, which has now been electrified through the provision of power from the facility that you can see on the slide, but also several villages around the hospital have been electrified as well. These are villages where if they'd had power at all, in the past, they'd had it from a diesel generator. So it was only available to them when the diesel itself was available to whoever was selling them the power. And if it was available at a very high cost. The cost that this hydropower represents is substantially lower than what these villagers were paying before. Now this is a very small scale version of the work that we do. The facility you see is about 500 kilowatts only, which is not very large. And the cascade that we hope to develop won't be too much larger than that. But I think it's an interesting window into the kind of work that we do, the kind of opportunities that our work presents to U.S. businesses, and how the work that we do can be scaled up across the continent. So in terms of scaling it up across the continent, let's just take a look at, from a broader perspective, what our portfolio looks like. We're very active in the gas sector, in part because the U.S. enjoys such a strong competitive position internationally in the gas sector, but in part because it's a really good fit for a lot of the challenges, not all of them, but for a lot of the challenges that Africa is facing. This slide doesn't really do justice to our portfolio. There are a number of ventures in our portfolio that aren't represented here. For example, we're working with the Dangote Group, one of the most significant corporations in Africa, on a refinery and pipeline project in Nigeria. We're also working on a compressed natural gas terminal for a transportation project in Nigeria, and a few other odds and ends. But this is a useful kind of summary of the work that we're doing in natural gas. My hope is that your takeaway from this slide is the $5 billion in potential export opportunities for U.S. businesses should all of these projects fructify. In a lot of ways, the solar opportunities that we're pursuing around the continent are just as compelling. The export content possibilities for U.S. businesses are certainly less so. But the opportunity for impact in Africa is really profound. Solar facilities can be built quickly. The cost of power is extremely low, and Africa is among in many corners of Africa are among the sunniest places on the planet. This is a very interesting resource to be harnessing in order to accomplish some of those previously stated objectives of providing power, facilitating access. The reason I like our solar portfolio so much is because of its breadth from a capacity standpoint. On one end of the spectrum, we're sponsoring a 100 megawatt solar CSP, concentrated solar power project in the Western Cape of South Africa. This is quite a sophisticated technology. There are precedents for it around the world, but very few. When this thing is built, it will be a really fantastic machine that will provide 20 to 24 hours of power. So that is to say, this is solar power that will continue delivering electricity into the grid after the sun goes down. At the other end of that spectrum, we're also working with a small business based in suburban Atlanta that offers a containerized solar mini-grid solution. These are 300 to 500 kilowatt machines. That is to say, very small machines that can be loaded into a shipping container, delivered to a village where previously there was no access to power, and a mini-grid can be essentially unfolded from the container. We see those two kinds of projects as solutions to very different kinds of problems, and we're proud to be playing a role in the delivery of those kinds of solutions all across the continent. I thought it would be valuable to give you a tour of some of the specific U.S. businesses that are benefiting from the kind of support that we provide. Starting up top is Rickley Hydropower. I visited the Rickley Hydropower factory in Columbus, Ohio, only a couple of months ago, and met with the team to discuss a new project that they have in Tanzania. We have a number of grant-funded activities ongoing in Tanzania, and in particular in the hydro space. In all of the activities that we fund, we, throughout the development life cycle, will work hard to expose project developers in Africa to opportunities to engage with U.S. businesses. In the course of engaging with one project developer in Africa, we brought them to Columbus, Ohio to tour the Rickley hydropower facility and a number of other facilities in the neighborhood, such as a foundry in Springfield, Ohio, which was responsible for creating the castings necessary to manufacture some of the larger turbines that are exported by Rickley. They were quite impressed by what they saw, and they filled an order for about a megawatt worth of turbines, which are presently being constructed. This will be anywhere from $500,000 to about $1 million worth of business. Not going to, accomplish the objectives of Power Africa on its own, but I think it's an interesting anecdote. Alivo is a Swiss battery manufacturer with a significant manufacturing presence in North Carolina. A recently opened factory there has big ambitions, not only to work in the domestic marketplace, but also to export its product abroad. We're working with Alivo to tie in what we think will be something like a 25 megawatt hour battery bank to a solar facility, a 40 megawatt photovoltaic solar facility in Kenya that has reached financial close and is very likely to soon be interconnected to the grid. A 40 megawatt solar PV plant in Kenya with a 25 megawatt hour battery storage solution would be really novel across not just Kenya, but throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. This is the kind of facility that has the potential to really demonstrate the utility of battery storage technology, the utility of solar, and the value proposition of US business in particular. We see storage as a real frontier, and we're eager to make sure that US manufactured content has a role to play on that frontier. And Alivo is a key partner of ours in that regard. So I've discussed Renuvia a little bit. They offer a containerized solar solution. Standard Microgrid in Sacramento, California, offers a similar solution. It's quite a bit smaller than what Renuvia offers. While with Renuvia, we are sponsoring a pilot test of 8 facilities throughout rural Kenya. With Standard Microgrid, we're sponsoring a pilot test of about 150 facilities throughout Zambia in much more rural locations where smaller facilities are more appropriate. These are communities that have never had access to commercial energy for the most part, and there's very little demand. So a smaller facility, the kind of product that Standard Microgrid offers is much more appropriate in those kinds of contexts. Finally, Lanxin Energy. These guys are fascinating to me. What they offer is a system that can be incorporated into existing geothermal power generation technology. Lanxin Energy can capture heat that would otherwise be vented to the atmosphere and turn it into electricity. The technology has been deployed in the United States. It's been deployed in other developed world contexts. All of those contexts, for the most part, are mature. There's not very much greenfield geothermal development happening in the developed marketplaces of the world. For Lanxin Energy, for companies like Lanxin Energy in the US, emerging markets represent their growth opportunities. They were excited to engage with USTDA because they didn't otherwise have an avenue into Africa. Through our grant funding, they are able to pilot test their technology in the African context, in this case in a Kenyan context in the Olkaria field, learn from it, understand how to modify their business model in order to accommodate the country context, and hopefully grow, hopefully expand into other adjoining marketplaces. So I've talked a lot about our global portfolio. I've talked about our Africa portfolio. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we work with businesses in 50 states, and Indiana is certainly among them. We, over our institutional life, have attributed about 60 million plus or minus to Indiana businesses. That is to say, we have attributed about $60 million in exports from Indiana businesses around the world, to emerging markets around the world, that are attributable to the work that USTDA has done. So we're very proud of that legacy. We're proud of those activities, and we hope to find new ways to engage with businesses throughout the U.S. And of course in Indiana as well. So this brings me to the end of my presentation here. Since this is such a small crowd, I was hoping that we could engage in something like a conversation. So I would welcome any questions that you have, either about USTDA, the role that we play in Africa or in other emerging marketplaces. Sir.
My question would be, how does an Indiana company interact with USTDA? I think that's the essential question that most people would say, okay, this sounds interesting.
Yeah.
You know, how do I take advantage of it as a small company if I'm not the size of Cummins, for example, here locally?
Sure.
What do I do?
Sure. So there are a lot of large companies on this list, no doubt, but some small ones as well. The small companies that we've engaged with in Indiana around the world, around the United States, for the most part, they have participated in our reverse trade missions. And this is not something that I went into too much detail about, of course, in my talk, but they're a key part of what we do. The Department of Commerce sponsors trade missions from time to time, where delegates will go to marketplaces abroad to learn more about what's going on in those marketplaces. What TDA does is really very different. We will take delegates from, let's say, procurement agencies in emerging market governments. We will take business leaders from target emerging markets themselves and give them a tour of the value proposition of U.S. business. We will take them to Columbus, Ohio, for example, to visit with Rickley Hydropower. We'll take them to Carson City, Nevada, to visit with Lanxin Energy. We do that regularly. That's a key component of the work that we do. And it's a great way for small businesses to get engaged with emerging marketplaces without ever leaving the zip code. We advertise our reverse trade mission activities months in advance. The best way to keep up with that is certainly on our website. My contact information is on this slide. I can refer you directly to the spot on our website where we tend to park this information. In addition to that, if there is a Indiana business, if there is a domestic business anywhere in the U.S. that is working with, let's say, an African enterprise on an infrastructure venture, we can examine a proposal for grant funding on an ongoing basis. We don't publish periodic calls for proposals. We are always receptive to proposals from qualifying entities. A brief note about what might qualify as a prospective offer from USTDA's perspective. We have to engage with an entity in an emerging market. That has to be our grantee. But no USTDA funds ever go directly to that grantee. We help that grantee enter into a contract with a U.S. business who will provide a scope of services to that grantee. And all of the USTD funds go to pay the invoices of that contractor. If there are Indiana service providers, let's say an engineering firm, eager to work with, let's say, a special purpose vehicle developing a ring-fenced 100-megawatt gas-fired power project in Nigeria, we could review a proposal from that entity, so from that Indiana contractor, from that gas-fired power project promoter for grant funding. Our grant packages typically are on the order of about $500,000 to $1.5 million. The larger the grants themselves, the more scrutiny they would tend to draw from our executive board. But there is plenty of precedent for us extending grants on the order of about $1 million for power project promotion, for infrastructure project promotion more broadly. Sir?
I'm just
So the question was concerning the mini grid? Okay. Well, the objectives of the Power Africa initiative very broadly are to help establish new capacity, so new megawatts at centralized generating stations, but also to expand access to customers that presently aren't connected to any central grid. USTDA accomplishes that second objective in part by sponsoring mini-grid activities. Now, mini-grids in this context are defined as enterprises where a generating station, so an electrical generating station, isn't interconnected with any sort of central grid. It's just a standalone generating and power distribution enterprise. There are several models that we are exploring through feasibility studies and through pilot tests throughout our portfolio. And the two that I mentioned, which I think are among the most compelling, are the standard microgrid model that we're pilot testing in Zambia, and the Renuvia model that we're pilot testing in Kenya. The standard microgrid delivers a very small kilowatt scale solution that rolls into the village on a trailer in an intermodal shipping container and can be deployed once again at a kilowatt scale to several hundred villagers, can establish several hundred new connections. The Renuvia model is only a little bit different. It is also containerized. It is also solar generating technology, but it can deliver power to perhaps 1,000 people. We feel like there is probably a role in the marketplace for certainly these two types of solutions, and probably many others as well. So we feel it's a small part of our mandate to provide a venue, just to get those marketplaces out, get those technologies out into the marketplace, to see what works and what doesn't, and to help U.S. businesses sort of understand the utility of what they're doing, modify, course correct, and hopefully deploy at a larger scale. Any other questions? Ma'am.
Yeah, one question. You talked about the U.S., but what about other countries? For example, China's very important role in infrastructure. How does the U.S. compete, not compete with some of the other players?
Sure. So it's an excellent point. China is a very strong competitor across Sub-Saharan Africa. Often when there are competitive tenders released by governments, the Chinese can be quite competitive. They typically come in with a much lower cost. The Chinese have the benefit of being state enterprises often, enjoying economies of scale that the U.S. private sector doesn't necessarily enjoy. We feel, and we feel this quite strongly, that U.S. businesses can articulate a certain kind of a value proposition that Chinese businesses struggle to articulate, that U.S. businesses have a lower life cycle cost, even if Chinese products may have a lower upfront cost. A big push of USTDA over the last few years has been to try to articulate that message directly to procurement agencies in target emerging markets around the world. For example, in an African context, in both Ethiopia and Botswana, presently, we have advisors who are working with very sensitive procurement-oriented agencies and advising them in terms of the unique value proposition, not just of U.S. businesses, but of incorporating best value decision-making into their procurement activities. So ensuring that it's not just the lowest cost that wins the award, but it's the lowest life cycle cost and the greatest value that wins the award. We feel pretty strongly that the more agencies that begin to focus on best value procurement out there in Sub-Saharan Africa and in other emerging marketplaces, the stronger the competitive position of U.S. enterprises will be. Ma'am, I believe you had a question as well. That isn't, that's certainly a critical area. The question concerned capacity building and workforce development. This isn't an area where US TDA plays a direct role. More typically, we're involved in the feasibility study for the infrastructure project itself, not necessarily building the capacity, building the enabling environment around that facility. With the exception, I would say, of the work that we're doing around procurement reform, the work that we're doing, let's say, evangelizing about the benefits of best value procurement versus lowest cost procurement. Sir. We certainly do both kinds. The small hydropower project from several slides ago, you might recall, that was a rehabilitation of an existing facility. More frequently, I'll say that we work with greenfield projects, so we're developing infrastructure ventures from scratch, but we're more than receptive to rehabilitating existing facilities as well. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Sir.
Sorry, just one more question. I was curious about, you were particularly concerned not to impose this on Africa, and that's a reasonable concern, and I know that they're really needed with the work that we do there ourselves. But I was wondering whether you guys are considering helping African states and government have a sort of a policy structure in place that will be able, in fact, to appreciate all the work that has been done to power Africa.
The Power Africa initiative, more broadly, is working quite closely, directly with governments throughout the continent. US TDA doesn't tend to engage directly with governments, although we do, and in fact, we work with governments from time to time as grantees. In Kenya, for example, the KPCL, excuse me if I have the acronym incorrectly, maybe someone in the room can correct me, but the utility in Kenya is among our grantees. We're developing a small solar power project with the government of Kenya directly. But the larger Power Africa initiative is much more engaged with host country governments. For example, USAID, the key implementing agency of Power Africa, that's the U.S. Agency for International Development, they have a whole network of advisors who are embedded within key ministries in several countries. And they are probably in the best position to be describing the value of the work that we're doing, which the good news is that I believe is widely accepted. I believe that the countries where both US TDA and the broader Power Africa initiative are most active are quite receptive to the work that we're doing, aware of its value, and eager to continue to engage with us. Sir.
I'm related to a university in the capital city of Burundi, Bujumbura. I wonder what your attitude is toward the more troubled parts of eastern Congo and countries like Burundi.
Yeah, I had a compelling conversation earlier this morning about the DRC. Unfortunately, there are some marketplaces where it's very difficult for us to do business. DRC, and for the time being, Burundi are among them. The simple problem being that it seems to us that it is that the financial community regards Burundi as a very problematic place to extend capital, to extend debt in particular. And as a result of that, it's viewed as much more, certainly much more risky. As that's a situation we continue to monitor. I would love an excuse to work in Burundi's, particularly their small hydropower marketplace. There's an enormous amount of opportunity there to build out capacity, to extend access. But for the time being, we can't work there. Other countries in that category would include Zimbabwe, and the other usual suspects of Eritrea and South Sudan. I think one more question, and then we'll have to move on, if in fact there is another question. No more questions. Okay. Well, thank you very much.